I'd like to offer also a special welcome to those people around the world who you might know are streaming this event because of its significance. We've got several Florey neuroscientists who are overseas who are attending conferences, and they're going to tune in. Wherever you are, I hope you enjoy the next hour live from the Melbourne Town Hall. For those of you who don't know much about us, the Florey is one of the largest brain research institutes in the world. We're working to improve the lives of the 1 in 5 Australians, 1 in 5, who experience a major brain disorder every year. Dedicated neuroscientists at the Florey are seeking to prevent or cure, to improve the lives of people affected by a range of devastating conditions such as Alzheimer's disease, depression, epilepsy, stroke, right through to multiple sclerosis and others, which need our desperate attention. The Kenneth Myer lecture has been presented now since 1995. The Myer family, in particular the late Kenneth Myer, after whom this lecture is named, have been a critical and long-standing champion of the Florey. Ken's son Martin, I introduced before, has been also a great supporter and was a catalyst for this event. Indeed, I must say, it was his stroke of genius to invite a very special person you're going to hear from very shortly. So this year, we've deviated a little. We've invited someone other than an internationally renowned neuroscientist. We've realised that the brain research is more than just simply about the science. It's about communicating the science. Without the communication, we're lost. And it's absolutely essential we communicate as clearly as possible. So this year, we've invited one of the world's great science communicators, Mr. Bill Bryson, OBE. You may know that Bill has sold more than 10 million copies of his books, and they've been translated into over 45 languages. His science book, A Short History of Nearly Everything, won the 2005 Aventus Prize of the Royal Society and the Descartes Prize of the European Union's highest literary award. Not only that, he was Chancellor of the University of Durham from 2005 to 2011. And in 2006, he was awarded the President's Prize by Britain's Royal Society of Chemistry. He's also an honorary fellow of the British Science Association and of the Royal Society of Chemistry. Indeed, a very distinguished curriculum vitae. He was born in Des Moines. I'm sure those of you who have read his books realise exactly that, in Iowa, but has spent much of his life in adult England. He lives in Norfolk with Cynthia, his wife, who we also welcome tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, to present his lecture, An Even Shorter History of Everything, Mr. Bill Bryson.
Well, thank you very, very much, and thank you, Jeff, for that kind introduction. And thank you all for coming, so many of you. I'm so honored and overwhelmed, in fact. I'm really thrilled, as always, to be back in Australia, and particularly, I have to say, in Melbourne. This was the first place in Australia that I ever came to, and this is where I really first lost my heart to this big, amazing country of yours. So it's always felt a little bit like home to me in Australia. So I really do have a genuine fondness for it. This is my 6th or possibly even 7th visit to Melbourne, and I'm so glad that to be able to say now that I have lived long enough to see it when the sun was shining. So thank you very much. It's been a wonderful week that I've been here already. And thank you above all to the Florey Insitute for this incredible, and I have to say, embarrassingly undeserved award and for the privilege of delivering the 16th Kenneth B. Myer lecture. This is a huge honor for me, as big as an honor as I've ever had, so I really am genuinely thrilled and delighted to be here. But I have to say it's always a little daunting for me to find myself in circumstances such as this, standing up in front of a room full of people, particularly in a setting of such elegance and splendor, in front of such a good-looking and large audience. And I was part of a series of such distinction and importance, because circumstances like that make me feel as if I really, really ought to try to say something significant or important or even profound. And I have to warn you at the outset that I've just never been terribly good at profundities. I'm one of those people that always blurts out the wrong thing. The last time I can remember this happening was I had to fill out an author questionnaire for a publication of W.H. Smith, the British bookshop chain. And one of the questions on the questionnaire was, what would you like people to be saying about you 100 years from now? Which is a really tough question, and I thought very hard about it. What would I have people say about me 100 years from now if I could have them say anything? And the answer I gave was, and the amazing thing is, he's still sexually active. So let me at the very beginning apologize if I fail to say anything suitably astute or incisive this evening. It's not for lack of respect for the occasion, believe me. Seriously, I really am delighted to be here, and all the more so now because over the past couple of days I've had a wonderful chance to tour some of the Florey labs and meet with a number of Florey people. And it was just fantastic. It really was fantastic. Fantastic and deeply enlightening and very, very exciting. There's always something wonderfully invigorating about being in an environment where first-rate minds are doing top-notch work, where you can practically hear the crackle and hum of advanced cerebral activity. But that is especially so at a neurological institute, I think, because there is nothing, after all, as I hope I will show in the course of this talk over the next 45 minutes or so, there's nothing at all more important than what's up here. Or sometimes more worrying, I might add. Just before I came away on this trip, I spoke to a neuroscientist from the University of Glasgow who works on Alzheimer's disease. I was just doing a bit of research for this lecture. And in the course of our conversation, he told me something that put the threat of Alzheimer's into chilling perspective for me. He told me that because so many of us are getting old, and so many of us are getting Alzheimer's, within 25 years at present rates, the cost of treating Alzheimer's just in the UK will be equal to the total amount of money that Britain spends on the National Health Service today for everything. And I asked someone here at the Florey about that when I was touring the Florey Insitute labs the other day, and they told me that already here in Australia, the costs of treating Alzheimer's is about as much as the country spends right now on treating cancer and heart diseases combined. So we are in the position that a single neurological disorder will cost all of us unbelievably dearly unless we find a cure for it, or at least a way to dramatically slow and control its onset. And that is exactly the sort of thing that the Florey Institute does. But as most of you know, and as Jeff told you, it is only one of several things it does. Florey is also doing heroic work with Parkinson's disease and autism, addiction, epilepsy, stroke, motor neuron disease, and any number of other horrible things that can go wrong with your brain and will, rather depressingly, affect 1 in every 5 of us at some point in our lives. Which is why the Florey Institute is truly so important, and why you are so lucky to have an institution of such international distinction right here in Melbourne. So when I say I am pleased and proud to be here, believe me, I really am pleased and proud to be here. So thank you for bringing me out here. Excuse me. Now, what I thought I would like to do this evening, if I may, if it's all right, is really just 2 fairly simple things. I thought, first of all, I'd like to tell you my American bear story. It has absolutely no relevance to anything to do with the lecture I'm about to give, but I just always tell it, and I love to tell it, and I always think that a talk should begin with some kind of a story anyway, and it's the only story I know, so I'm going to tell it to you. And then things will become rather more serious for a while, but I hope not too uninteresting, and I would like to talk to you for some time about how incredibly lucky you are to be here, how lucky indeed we all are, and not just here in this spectacular auditorium or even in Melbourne, but on this planet and in this universe. And then if there is time at the very end, I would like to read to you a short passage from one of my books, which I almost always read when I'm in Melbourne, and which I think explains why I really do love this city as much as I do. So first, for the bear story. The bear story is an outgrowth of an experience I had a few years ago when I tried, rather foolishly, to hike the Appalachian Trail in America in the company of an overweight companion named Stephen Katz. Now, the Appalachian Trail, if you don't know, is an immensely long and really quite challenging long-distance hiking trail. It was the longest one in the United States. It runs for 2,200 miles up the eastern seaboard through 14 states, from Springer Mountain in Georgia all the way up to Mount Katahdin in Maine. And it's really hard. It just goes on and on and on. And everything that the North American wilderness can throw at you is out there. Rattlesnakes and bobcats and lightning strikes and sudden blizzards and goodness knows what else. And if by chance you read the book, you'll know that I grew somewhat preoccupied, genuinely preoccupied with the dangers of bear attacks while hiking in the eastern woods of the United States. And I was very gratified to discover after the book came out that lots and lots of people all over North America shared these concerns, because I got letters by the sackful from people giving me advice on how to avoid bear attacks while hiking in the woods. And here the basic advice seems to be always to go hiking with someone who can't run as fast as you can. But there was one letter I got from a lady in New Hampshire where I was then living that particularly pleased me. And she told me that when you go hiking out west in grizzly bear country, and grizzly bears really are quite dangerous creatures, there are two things they tell you you should do wherever you go. They tell you that, first of all, you should wear little bells on your clothing, because this actually alerts the bears you're coming and you don't overtake them by surprise. And the second thing they tell you should do wherever you go is that you should look out on the ground ahead of you for grizzly bear scat, or dung. And the way you can recognize grizzly bear scat is that it has little bells in it. Thank you. And so to the slightly more serious business of this evening, now, which is namely how lucky we are to be here. Now, some years ago, as you will know, I wrote another book called A Short History of Nearly Everything, which was my attempt to understand the universe and the world and everything else around us, and how they both got to be the way they are. Or as I put it in the book, how we went from there being nothing at all to there being something, and then how a little of that something eventually turned into us. And one of the things that particularly fascinated me was how scientists figure things out. How do they know where the continents were 300 million years ago? Or how hot it is on the surface of the sun? Or what goes on at the heart of a gene? Or what was happening in the universe in its first 3 minutes? How do they even know that the universe had a first 3 minutes and hasn't just been there forever? How does anybody ever figure these things out? And so the book became a kind of quest to find out not only what we know, but how we know what we know. And so for about 4 years, I did almost nothing but try to understand science and its achievements. I traveled to 11 countries on 5 continents, read lots and lots of books and journals and transcripts and monographs, and asked enormous amounts of extremely dumb questions to incredibly kind and patient experts from a variety of disciplines from many of the world's leading institutions, including here in Australia. And I didn't have any particular outcome in mind, no axe to grind or anything like that. I was just trying to pack an empty mind with as much interesting information as it could hold. But in doing the book, I found myself being drawn again and again to certain inescapable, elemental, but really quite important conclusions about the universe we live in and our part in it, including 5 really remarkable facts. I think they may be the 5 most remarkable facts there are. And since you were kind enough to invite me here, I thought I would share them with you now in order to save you having to go to the trouble of and expense of traveling around the world to find out for yourself. It seemed to me the least I could do. Actually, I'm joking, of course. You don't need to be told these facts because you know them already. I knew them, and I knew absolutely nothing about science before I started working on the book. They are all exceedingly obvious facts. But the one thing I learned in my short, stimulating visit to the world of science is that the most elemental and obvious things are often the most amazing. And I think that's especially true of these 5. So here, without ado, they are the 5 most remarkable facts I know. First, you exist. You're alive. That's really quite a marvelous thing to be able to say when you stop to think about it. For you to be here now, trillions and trillions of drifting atoms had somehow to come together to make you. In the whole history of the universe, atoms have never got together in quite that way before, and they never will again. There has never been, there will never again be anything in the universe quite like you. You are gloriously, eternally unique. These atoms that make you came to Earth from all over, from every corner of the cosmos. Every one of us is made up of uncountable trillions of particles that were coughed out by dying stars in distant galaxies and have spent unimaginable eons drifting through space. They could have ended up anywhere, but for some reason, a modest assortment of them have decided to come together for a few tens of years to be you. That's pretty extraordinary, if you ask me. Now, why atoms do this is a puzzle. Being you is not a gratifying experience for the atom. An atom doesn't even know you're there. It doesn't even know it is there. Atoms are mindless particles after all. They don't know a thing. Yet somehow, for the length of your existence, these tiny devoted particles will engage in all the delicate cooperative efforts necessary to keep you humming, to make you you, to give you form and shape and let you enjoy the rare and supremely agreeable condition known as life. Now that's really hard to explain because there's nothing special about the atoms that make you. A human being or any other living thing is an assortment of almost embarrassingly mundane components. Some carbon, hydrogen, oxygen and nitrogen, a little calcium, a dash of sulfur, a sprinkling of other very common chemicals. This is the same stuff you would find in a pile of dirt. The only thing special about the atoms that make you is that they make you. That is, of course, the miracle of life. Excuse me. But having obliging atoms is only a small part of the good fortune that got you here to Melbourne on an October evening in 2012. You've also been incredibly lucky genealogically, ancestrally. Statistically speaking, you shouldn't be here now. None of us should. Survival on Earth is surprisingly hard. It is a curious fact of our existence that we come from a planet that is very good at producing life, but even better at extinguishing it. Of all the billions of species of organism that have sprung up on Earth in its long productive history, 99.99% are no longer here. They are gone forever. The amazing fact is that the normal condition for a species on Earth is to be extinct. The average species on this planet lasts for only about 4 million years on average. If you wish to last longer, as we most assuredly do, then you must continually recreate yourself. You must be prepared to change everything that defines you: shape, size, color, physiology, diet, metabolism, everything. And to do so repeatedly in exactly the right sequence at precisely the right historical moments. And that's just what we have done, or at least what our ancestors did for us. Again and again and again, in the most amazingly timely fashion, they changed their body plans and way of life in exactly the manner necessary to keep us going. So that sometimes in our long history as beings, we have been furry and sometimes sleek. Sometimes we've lived in water, sometimes in holes in the ground. Sometimes we've been pretty big, like now, but most of the time we've been small and furtive and inconsequential, which is a good thing to be when times are tough. All of these changes have been random, but wonderfully, fantastically timely. And thanks to all these transformations, we have managed to escape every single extinction event on Earth, and there have been many. We've always been the right body shape at the right time to scramble out of the way or dive beneath the water or otherwise take an evasive action that ensured our survival. If all of these things hadn't happened just when they did in just the right order, we almost certainly wouldn't still be here today. We most certainly wouldn't be humans. So as a species, we have been extremely fortunate. But even that's not enough to get you here tonight in Melbourne. It's not even close to enough. Because as well as attaining life and belonging to a triumphant species, you've also been personally lucky to an extraordinary degree. Every one of us in this room has nearly 4 billion years of reproductive good fortune behind us. Consider the fact that for you to be here now, your parents had to bond in a specifically timely manner, as did their parents before them and theirs before them, and so on, all the way back to the dawn of time. Had any of these people mated on a different day or a different hour, possibly a different moment, certainly with a different mate, you wouldn't be here now. If you consider that each of your parents had 2 parents and that each of theirs had 2 more and each of theirs 2 more and so on, you've got a lot of ancestors to be indebted to. 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, and so on. Push backwards through time, and these ancestral doublings swiftly add up in a really quite arresting way. Go back just 8 generations to just about the time Victoria was founded, and already you have over 250 direct ancestors, without any of whom you wouldn't be here now. Continue further to the time of Shakespeare, say, and you have no fewer than 16,384 direct ancestors earnestly exchanging genetic material in a way that could only produce you. And so it goes through the breathtaking process of genetic compounding. By 20 generations ago, over 1 million people have been busy on your behalf. By 25 generations, it's 33 million, and so it goes. You are, in short, at the end of a very long line of successful pairings, going all the way back to the days, some 3 billion years ago, when you were a unicellular, microscopic blob. That's quite a winning streak when you think about it. Every one of your ancestors since the dawn of time, every single one has been attractive enough to find a mate, robust enough to reproduce, and sufficiently blessed by fate and circumstance to live long enough to do so. Not one of them on either side was squashed, devoured, stranded, starved, stuck fast, upstaged by a more glamorous suitor, spurned or otherwise deflected from its life's quest of delivering a tiny charge of genetic material to the right partner at the right moment to perpetuate the only possible sequence of hereditary combinations that could result, eventually, astoundingly, and all too briefly, in you. Now, I don't wish to belabor the point, but when you think about it for just a minute, life is an incredibly lucky thing. Your existence is a miracle, and you shouldn't let a day pass that you don't rejoice in having it, for it is bounded, I can tell you, by 2 very long eternities. So life, your life and any other life, is not only astounding, indeed pretty well miraculous, but it is also, as far as we yet know, unique to this planet, which is my second amazing fact. Life doesn't happen anywhere else in the universe as far as we can tell, or at least as far as we know. Now that really is odd. The atoms that so congenially clump together to form living things on Earth seem completely disinclined to do it elsewhere. No one can say why that is. Of course, the evidence isn't all in yet. So far, astronomers have found only about 850 planets beyond our own solar system, out of the 10 billion trillion or so that are thought to exist in the universe at large. So we can hardly claim to have scoured every corner of the universe. But it is certainly the case that the only life that has turned up so far, and very possibly ever will, is found on a single, unprepossessing blue planet in a nameless solar system 2/3 of the way out from the center of the Milky Way. Now that's not much in a great big universe, particularly when you consider that all the life on that small blue planet is found almost exclusively in a frail wisp of water and atmosphere around the very surface. If you imagine the Earth shrunk down to the size of a standard desktop globe, then our atmosphere, our whole atmosphere, is only about the thickness of a couple of coats of varnish. And the part of that atmosphere that actually supports life, the biosphere as it is known, is only a small part of that, even within the atmosphere. Most of the Earth is too cold or dry or lofty and thin-aired for most types of life. Humans, even with the advantage of clothing and sheltered and boundless ingenuity, can manage to live on only about 12% of Earth's landscape, or only 4% of the total surface if you include the surface of the seas. Other animals are restricted further still. In consequence, most of Earth's life is confined to an exceedingly, indeed an unnervingly, modest range. Just 1.4% of Earth's land area contains more than half its biodiversity. I can't think of a better reason than that to be worried about global warming. All the rest of the universe, all that we know of, is deeply, instantaneously inimical to life. In a world, we live in a universe that doesn't seem to want us here. That's quite a stunning thought. The likelihood, of course, is that there is other life out there in the universe at large, possibly quite a lot of it. With 10 billion trillion planets to choose from, the statistical probability is that there's not just millions of advanced civilizations in the universe at large, but it's thought billions. Think about that, billions of other civilizations out there. The trouble is that phrase, at large. Space, it turns out, is extremely well named. It is huge, huge. Even our own solar system is built to a scale beyond simple imagining. I was amazed and quite delighted in the course of working on my book to discover that one of my particle physicists, one of the people who's helping me most closely, turned out to have no idea at all, absolutely no idea at all, just how big our solar system is. So let me tell you now, it's big. We're all used to seeing charts of the solar system showing the planets coming one after another at neighborly intervals. Often in artists' renderings, they're depicted so close together that they actually cast shadows on each other. But that is a necessary deceit to get them to fit on the same poster or double-page spread. The true scale of the solar system is really quite different. Neptune in reality isn't just a little beyond Jupiter, it's way beyond Jupiter, 5 times further from Jupiter than Jupiter is from us, so far out that it receives only about 3% as much sunlight as Jupiter does. And Pluto, which I know is no longer officially a planet, but it's still an important object in our solar system, is so much further out again that from its icy surface, the sun is just a pinpoint of light in the darkness, just another star in the night sky. That's how far out it is, and yet it is its sun as much as it is our sun. And Pluto isn't even close to the end of the solar system anyway. Beyond it is a vast, mysterious realm of darkness and drifting comets known as the Oort cloud, named after a Dutch astronomer. The Oort cloud is so far out that we can't actually see it. Its existence is described in textbooks as probable but hypothetical. Now that's kind of amazing too when you think about it, that we can't even be sure of all the stuff that's in our own solar system. It's that big. The basic unit of measurement in the solar system is known as this astronomical unit. Earth is 1 astronomical unit from the sun. Pluto is 40. The Oort cloud is 50,000. The point I'm trying to make is that our own solar system is so vast that there isn't any realistic prospect, based on what we know and can reasonably imagine, that we will ever leave our own solar system. Beyond the Oort cloud lies an emptiness beyond imagining. Our nearest star, Proxima Centauri, is 4.3 light years away, which doesn't sound very much, but that's 100 million times further than the moon. To reach it by spaceship would take 25,000 years. And even then you wouldn't be anywhere but at a lonely star in the middle of a vast nowhere. To reach the next landmark of consequence would involve another 25,000 years of travel. And so it would go if you tried to star hop your way across the cosmos. Just reaching the center of our own Milky Way would take far longer than we have existed as beings. So we may be one of millions of advanced civilizations, perhaps even billions, but for all practical purposes, we are quite alone and probably always likely to remain so. According to a Gallup poll of a few years ago that I still marvel at, 1.3 million Americans seriously believe that they have been abducted by aliens at one time or another. 1.3 million. Arguably, the world would be a better place if some of them had been. But it is unlikely that there has ever been or ever will be direct contact between Earth and any other civilizations that may be out there. They're just too far away. The distance between advanced civilizations, it's thought, is likely to average at least 200 light years. Goodness knows how they figure these things out, but that's what they say. And that means that even if alien beings know that we're here and are somehow able to train giant telescopes on us and are watching us, as it were, on large screen TV somewhere, they're watching light that left Earth 200 years ago. So they're not seeing us in 2012, they're watching Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington, or Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and so on, people in powdered wigs and silk stockings. Any message that they sent to us would take 200 years to get there, and any reply we made would take 200 years to be heard. So if there is life elsewhere in the universe, our fellow beings, however advanced, are in all likelihood as solitary, as lonesome, and vulnerable, and on their own as we are. In practical terms, we are alone. There's nobody to look after us but us. But of course, you don't need me to tell you this. You have only to look up at a big starry sky on any night of the week to realize that the universe is a big place and that there's not a lot of life to the square meter. So we are very fortunate to be here on our lovely, warm, hospitable, watery planet, probably as fortunate as you can get. Now, there may be no other detectable life in the universe, but there is absolutely, clearly, no shortage of it here. There is so much life on Earth, in fact, that we don't actually know how much there is, which is my third amazing fact, that we live on a planet that we don't really know. We don't even remotely know what is here on our own planet. I find that quite amazing, too. Even more amazing, we don't even know what we know. No one has ever managed to collate the total number of known, living, recorded things on this planet. Most estimates for the number of named species on Earth usually fix on a figure of about 1.5 million, but that's really only a guess. As far as for the number of unnamed, yet to be identified species of living things, we are even more clueless. It may be tens of millions, it may be hundreds of millions. But according to one extraordinary but respectable estimate, as much as 97% of all that lives on the Earth and in the seas is still to be discovered. And that's just visible life. It doesn't include microbial life, almost all of which is still unknown to us. If you have any dirt in the soles of your shoes, you're probably, or so I'm reliably informed, carrying around at least several scores of microbes that are quite unknown to science. Some years ago, a pair of Norwegian scientists conducted a simple but really quite stunning experiment. They went out into a beech forest near their lab in Bergen, scooped up a gram of soil, and analyzed it microscopically. They found that this one small random sample of Norwegian soil contained between 4,000 and 5,000 separate bacterial species, more than the total number of soil species listed in the standard bacteriological manual of the time. Then they went a few miles away to the seaside, scooped up another gram of soil, and found over 4,000 other different species. They had, in effect, with 2 small scoops of earth just near their own lab, doubled the number of known species of soil bacteria. And of course, our ignorance doesn't apply just to microorganisms, it applies to nearly everything, to genes and the workings of cells, most of the processes of the mind, the causes of earthquakes, and much else that governs how happily and successfully we live. In short, we live on a planet we really barely know. What we do know and can say is that life is clearly precious and miraculous and rare, and they're not making any more of it. We have a sacred duty, that's really not putting it too strongly, to look after it. Earth may have the most interesting life in the universe, it may have the only life in the universe. It's certainly all that we're ever going to get. And to look on the bright side, if you are going to pass your collective existence in a state of supreme loneliness, what better place could you imagine to do it but Earth? What a wonderful and wondrous place this is. And what a lot we've done with just a little atmosphere, some water, a warming sun, and a few other helpful ingredients. Look around you the next time you are out of doors in the open air and marvel, I beg you, just marvel at the staggering inventiveness, the elegance and beauty and utility, the exquisite, unimprovable glory that is life on Earth. It is hard to believe that anywhere it could ever be better than this. And while you're looking around at all that at the life that Earth has produced, reflect, please, on a fourth extraordinary fact, in many ways the most extraordinary of all, namely that all life comes from a single moment of creation. Some 3.8 billion years ago, in some bubbly mud pot or deep ocean vent, some little bag of chemicals twitched and became animate, and then miraculously reproduced itself. Everything that lives now on Earth, or ever has lived, descends from that one moment. We are all built from a single original blueprint, a fact that scientists have only really recently, in the last generation or so, begun to appreciate. 60% of the genes that keep you sleek and purring are essentially the same as the genes in a fruit fly. Amazingly, we're even quite closely related to some fruit and vegetables, I'm told. About half the chemical functions that take place in a banana, believe it or not, are fundamentally the same as the chemical functions that take place in you. In short, all life is one, from the tiniest bacterium to the largest blue whale. I don't believe there is a more important or remarkable fact in the natural world, indeed in any world, than that one. Since that moment of creation, eons ago, Earth has produced, or so it is thought, some 30 billion different species of creature, which is a much, much larger number than it sounds. If you can imagine that I projected slides of each of those 30 billion creatures on the screen behind me at the rate of 1 a second, it would take nearly 1,000 years to show all 30 billion. So Earth has produced a lot of life in its time. And yet the one thing that not one of those other living things could do, not one, not even remotely, was think like we do. Which is my fifth and final point this evening. The most amazing thing in the universe is inside your head. You could well travel through every inch of outer space, through every swirling galaxy and lost solar system, and nowhere find anything as marvelous and complex and high-functioning as the 3 pounds of spongy mass between your ears. The human brain is a thing of pure wonder, and yet it is extraordinarily unprepossessing. For a start, it is 75 to 80% water, with the rest mostly split between fat and protein. Pretty amazing that 3 such mundane and ordinary substances can come together in a way that allows us thought and memory and consciousness and vision and aesthetic appreciation and all the rest. It is also a tremendously expensive machine. The brain makes up just 2% of our body weight, but it uses up 20% of our energy. In newborn infants, it's no less than 65%. The reason it works as well as it does is because it's full of pulsing neurons, 100 billion of them, I'm told, all complexly interlinked via 100 trillion synaptic connections and swarms of axons and glia and dendrites and basal ganglia and much else that, frankly, I don't begin to understand. But that's okay, because even the brightest minds in the world, even the heroic people laboring in large numbers at the Florey Institute, don't fully understand how the brain is put together and how it does the remarkable things it does in such a small, compact space. Considering how exhaustively the brain has been studied and for how long, it is amazing how much really elemental stuff we still don't know, or at least can't universally agree upon. Like what exactly is consciousness? Or what precisely is a thought? It's not something you can hold or measure or keep in a sealed beaker. It has no physical presence at all. And yet a thought is clearly real and a definite thing. Thinking is our most vital and miraculous talent, the one thing that sets us apart from all other living things. And yet in a profound physiological sense, we don't really know what thinking is. Much the same could be said of memory. We know about how memories are assembled and how and where they are stored, but not why we keep some and not others. It has nothing to do with actual value or utility. I can remember the entire starting lineup of the 1964 St. Louis Cardinals baseball team, something that has been of no importance to me for almost half a century. And yet I cannot recollect the telephone number of my own mobile phone, where I parked a car in any large car park, or what was the third of 3 things my wife told me to get at the supermarket, or often why I'm standing in a room that I've just walked into, or any of a great many other things that are unquestionably more urgent and useful and necessary than remembering the starting players for the 1964 Cardinals, who were, incidentally, Tim McCarver, Bill White, Julian Javier, Dick Groat, Ken Boyer, Lou Brock, Kurt Flood, and Mike Shannon, and I did write them down from memory. Among much else I learned in my short time at the Florey Institute is that we don't know why some people get Parkinson's disease and others don't. We know that people who suffer from Alzheimer's disease have an accumulation of a kind of protein called amyloid in their brains. Now, amyloid proteins play an important role in memory function, but in normal working brains they're used and then discarded. But in people with Alzheimer's, they don't get flushed away, but rather accumulate and aggregate until they reach a stage where they interfere with brain function, and the poor victims begin to manifest the tragic symptoms of Alzheimer's. That much is known. But what is not known, not yet, is what triggers this accumulation of destructive proteins and why it happens in some people but not others. One of the most remarkable, if entirely incidental, things I learned in my short visit to the Florey Institute this week is that we don't even know where the hot flushes of female menopause come from. There isn't any obvious physiological reason why women should suffer from this odd phenomenon. There's clearly no evolutionary benefit in it. But understanding both why it happens and how it happens could well help us to understand a great deal else about how the brain works. And you will be proud to know that the Florey Institute is one of the world leaders in this particular area. Perhaps even more remarkably, the animals that the Florey uses to conduct this research on are sheep. For sheep, amazingly enough, also have menopausal hot flushes. The very fact that this was discovered in Australia, I would submit, should be a matter of national pride. So there is a huge amount we have left to learn, and many things we may never learn. But equally, some of the things we do know are at least as amazing as the things we don't. Consider just for a minute vision. I'm sorry to dwell, but I find this just amazing. When you look at something, when an image strikes your retina, it takes a few hundred milliseconds for that information to travel along the optic nerve and for your brain to process it and work out what it is that it's seeing. By which time, of course, the world has slightly moved on. So what the brain does is it makes a prediction of what the world will be like 200 milliseconds in the future. And that's what you see. That's what we all see. That means that we never see the world as it is at this instant, but rather as it will be in a fraction of a moment in the future. We spend our lives looking at a world that doesn't yet quite exist. Isn't that amazing? The brain does this, by the way, because without this feature, you wouldn't be able to catch a ball or safely cross the street or do anything at all that involved movement and judgment and reflex. We would always be just a fraction of an instant behind the curve. Or consider the fact that you have a blind spot in the middle of your eye where the optic nerve attaches to it. There are no visual sensors there, so a spot in the middle of your field of vision is literally quite blind. And yet you're not aware of it, so you can't even make yourself see it because your brain fills it in for you automatically. Wherever you look, wherever you turn your head, your brain instantly fills in whatever is missing. Your brain, in short, looks out for you. So it is quite an amazing instrument. But it is also, paradoxically, a strikingly unreliable one. A psychologist named Elizabeth Loftus at the University of California at Irvine discovered some years ago that it is possible, through suggestion, to implant entirely false memories in people's heads, to convince them that they've had experiences that they've never actually had. That, for instance, they were traumatically lost in a department store or shopping mall when they were a small child, or that they were hugged by Bugs Bunny in Disneyland, even though Bugs Bunny is not a Disney character and has never been at Disneyland. And lots more in similar vein. Most remarkably, perhaps, she could actually show people pictures of themselves as a child in which the image had been manipulated to make them look as if they were in the basket of a hot air balloon. And very often the subjects would suddenly remember and vividly describe with complete sincerity the experience of going up in a hot air balloon as a child, even though it was known that they'd never actually done so. Now you might think that you could never be that suggestible. And you would almost certainly be right. Only about a third of people are that gullible. But other evidence shows that we all sometimes completely misrecall even the most vivid events. Every one of you in this room can say exactly where you were and what you were doing the moment you learned about the 9/11 disaster and saw that horrible footage of planes crashing into the Twin Towers in New York. Now, immediately after that event, a team of psychologists at the University of Illinois took detailed statements from 700 Americans about what they were doing at that terrible moment of impact. Then the psychologists came back a year later and asked the same 700 people the same questions, and they found that almost half had changed their stories in some significant way from just the year before. Put themselves in a different place when they said they first heard it, now believed they'd seen it on TV when in fact they'd heard it on the radio, and that sort of thing. Every one of them remains supremely confident that his or her memory was still flawless. So the brain is a truly amazing, if not always completely reliable organ. Where it is really, truly, indubitably stunning is when it is used cooperatively. What great things we can do when we work together. Before I came out here, I chatted briefly to the British neuroscientist Colin Blakemore, who some of you will remember gave the Kenneth Myer lecture in 2006. I was just asking him about his latest research, if there was anything that I should know about in preparing my speech. And the thing he mentioned to me immediately was how fast we are getting at generating and analyzing huge streams of data, and how dramatically this is speeding up what we know. Now, you'll all remember the Human Genome Project. It took 7 years and cost $3 billion, US dollars, to sequence the human genome. Now, Colin told me, we can do exactly the same work in a few hours for just $2,000. And soon he expects we'll be able to do it for $200 in half an hour. Now that's human ingenuity for you. But here's the thing I just cannot understand. The human brain has allowed us to do the most marvelous things, to conquer diseases, to create the most sumptuous music and art, to develop compassion, to manipulate the environment in ways that make it more productive and secure, to look beyond our own immediate needs, and to work out strategies for improving our lot and the lot of others, and to reflect upon our own place in the universe. That's all pretty glorious, of course. But for any reflective person, it also raises a kind of gloomy question. Namely, that if we are capable of all those noble and enterprising qualities, why are we also such idiots? Because equally, we are the only species that this planet has ever produced, or I dare say ever will, that has been reckless enough to trifle with the air it breathes, bulldoze its forests and jungles, dynamite its coral reefs, drive to extinction creatures on land, sea, and in the air, and to imperil its very own existence. Which is, on reflection, perhaps the sixth and final thing I learned in the course of my research, that though we have a great brain, we can't be relied upon to use it wisely. As a result, we find ourselves in the uncanny position in the early 21st century of being life's best hope and its worst nightmare simultaneously. I find that truly astonishing. It took our forebears nearly 4 billion years to get us to this position of dangerous eminence, and now we could undo much of it in a single lifetime or two. The one thing I couldn't find an answer to at all in my 4-year visit to science and how it works was how we can have such great minds and yet collectively be such clods. We have the greatest gift that could possibly be bestowed, life, and the only brain that has ever existed that can truly understand what a wonderful, lucky gift that is, and yet we take it utterly for granted. So the parting question I would ask all scientists here this evening, in every field, and above all, those of you who are young and preparing to become scientists for the next generation, is this. Why is it so hard for us to grasp collectively that what is marvelous for us, existence, is marvelous for all things? Why don't we function better as a species? Why can we not appreciate automatically that we have all the water we're ever going to get, the only air we're going to breathe, a climate we can live with now, a planet that is sublimely beautiful and deeply accommodating and nearly perfect for our needs? We're not going to find new oceans teeming with life or some backup Amazonia that we have somehow till now overlooked. We have all we're ever going to have. This is all there is. There's nowhere else to go. The most brilliant and thoughtful naturalist of our generation, Edward O. Wilson, put it better and more succinctly than anyone ever has. In his classic work, The Diversity of Life, he wrote, "One planet, one experiment." It really is as simple as that. And we should never, ever forget that. Oh, and there's just one other thing I learned about life while researching my book. It doesn't last very long, I'm afraid. Even a good full human life goes on for only about 650,000 hours, which doesn't sound very much to me. So there really isn't a moment to be lost. Now, I don't know about you, but with that in mind, I'm really going to enjoy a drink very shortly. Now, you've been very patient and listened to me with rabbit on for quite a long time, and I really didn't want to end on too solemn a note. I mentioned earlier that I'd like to finish with something that's totally irrelevant to the subject of my lecture, but it's something that, it's the first story I heard in Melbourne when I came here, and it's when I realized how much I really loved Australia and the way it works. And it was a story that was told to me by my oldest friend in Australia, oldest in every sense, a woman named Catherine Veach. Now, Catherine came up to me on my first visit here. I went to the Melbourne Writers' Festival. It must have been about 20 years ago. And I did a something in front of a much, much tinier audience than this, and she came up to me afterwards to explain something, some mistake I'd made, or to correct me on some point. But anyway, we just got to chatting, and we really hit it off, and we formed this kind of strange friendship, strange in the sense that Catherine was just about old enough to be my mother, but we got along really well. And she took me out, invited me out to her house in St. Kilda, and I met the rest of her family and her kids who were all about my age, and I kind of became a friend of the families. So Catherine became, the Veitch family became the first people in Australia I really knew, and that's the background to this passage that I just want to read you. So we became great friends. Though it was a friendship based almost entirely on correspondence. Catherine had never been to America, and I went to Australia once a year if I was lucky, and then not always to Melbourne. But 3 or 4 times a year she would send me long, wonderfully discursive letters hammered out on a jumpy and willful typewriter. These letters seldom took less than an hour to read. In a single page, they could range over a galaxy of subjects. Her childhood in Adelaide, the inadequacies of certain politicians, what her children had been up to. Generally, she stuck in a wad of cuttings from The Age, the Melbourne newspaper. Much of what I know about Australia, I learned from her. I loved those letters. They came from so far away. Just getting an envelope from Australia still seemed to me a faintly wondrous event, and described experiences that were unexceptional to her, but breathtakingly exotic to me. Taking a tram into the city, suffering through a heat wave at Christmas, attending a lecture at the Royal Melbourne Institute, shopping for curtains at David Jones, the big local department store. I can't explain it except to say that without giving up any part of the life I had already, I wanted intensely to have all that in my life as well. So it was through her letters, more than from almost anything else, that I consolidated my fixation with Australia. Her letters were always happy, but the last one I received from her was especially sunny. She and John, her husband, were about to sell their house in St. Kilda and move to the Mornington Peninsula to take up a life of gracious retirement beside the sea. Just after she sent that letter, to the shock of everyone who knew her, Catherine suffered a sudden heart attack and died. I'd have been on my way to visit her now. Instead, all I can offer is my favorite of the many stories she told me. In the 1950s, a friend of Catherine's moved with her young family into a house next door to a vacant lot. One day, some builders arrived to put up a house on the vacant lot. Catherine's friend had a 3-year-old daughter who naturally took an interest in all the sudden activity going on next door. She hung around on the margins, and eventually the builders adopted her as a kind of mascot. They chatted to her and gave her little jobs to do, and at the end of the week, they presented her with a little pay packet containing a shiny new half-crown or something. The little girl took this home to her mother, who made all the appropriate cooings of admiration and suggested that they take it to the bank the next morning to deposit in the little girl's account. When they went to the bank, the cashier was equally impressed and asked the little girl how she had come by her own pay packet. "I've been building a house this week," she replied proudly. "Goodness," said the cashier, "and will you be building a house next week too?" "I will if we ever get the fucking bricks," answered the little girl. And on that note, I would say thank you very much.
Well, what a tour de force, and what a finishing note. I had the sense during the whole lecture, I had 2 sensations. One, I'm incredibly lucky to be here, and secondly, that I've just been incredibly lucky to hear one of the great lectures. A wonderful, wonderful event. Now, it's my enormous pleasure now to introduce to you Martin Myer. Martin is the son of Kenneth Myer, who I mentioned is the person after whom this lecture has been named. He was the founder of the Florey Institute many years ago, and Martin has been a contributor over the years as well, and indeed was a past chairman of the board. So who better than firstly to give formal thanks to Bill, and secondly to present the Kenneth Myer Medal. Martin Myer.
Well, Your Excellency, the Governor of Victoria, Bill and Cynthia Bryson, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health, it is my great pleasure to thank Mr. Bill Bryson for his delivery of the 16th Kenneth Myer Lecture, an even shorter history of nearly everything. As you've heard, my name's Martin Myer, and I'm the proud son of Kenneth Myer. With Derek Denton, Ian Potter, and many others, my father spent 30 years helping establish the Howard Florey Institute before tragically passing away in 1992. This lecture series, in my father's name, was established by the Florey shortly after his death with a gift from his estate. And the purpose of this gift was, and still is, to attract to Australia some of the world's most outstanding academics, and in doing so, giving the Florey community and the general public an exposure to a level of intellectual discourse that's not always available in Australia. With his lecture today, Bill has joined an esteemed alumni of Kenneth Myer lecturers, including, amongst others, James Watson, Eric Kandel, Sherwood Rowland, Colin Blakemore, and Peter Agray. Many of our lecturers are Nobel Prize winners, and given the focus of the Florey, it's not surprising that most of them have been neuroscientists. But it seemed appropriate in this year, the 20th anniversary of my father's death, that we invite one of the world's outstanding lay science communicators to deliver our lecture. So Bill, now it's turn for me to tell my story. I'll digress briefly here and explain to you, the audience, and to Bill, why this change of strategy was appropriate. And the reason is that, like you, Bill, my father was passionate about science and technology, and that what these two fields could do for the future benefit of mankind. But also, like you, Bill, my father was a lay person when it came to science and technical training. So much so that once as a child, I remember him opening the bonnet of his car when pulled up behind a VW Beetle with its bonnet open at a border inspection point. He was thinking that the official wanted to check his engine rather than his luggage. But as all of humanity knows, except obviously my father, the luggage in a Beetle is under the bonnet and not in the boot. So the border official gave my father the most peculiar look whilst peering into his engine. It was akin to, what planet do you live on? And as we've heard from Bill, there is only one. So he must have come from a very long way away. I've never forgotten that look. Well, none of this diminished his passion for science and technology. And my father's decades-long support of many scientific fields was justly rewarded by him being one of the few lay people to be made a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science. Ken was absolutely thrilled with this award. So it seemed appropriate to invite Bill, one of the world's most accomplished lay science communicators, to present our lecture. Bill's great achievement with his book, A Short History of Nearly Everything, is even all the more remarkable given it was his first major work on science. And as you've heard from Jeff, the book's critical and popular success has been appropriately recognised, with Bill being awarded the prestigious Aventus Prize in 2004 and the European Union's Descartes Prize in 2005. Bill's skill as a writer ensured that his passion for learning and excitement by the science came through a short history loud and clear. With Bill's engaging comments tonight on the 5 or maybe 6 things that he found most important and remarkable about science whilst researching his book, we've been lucky enough to have the privilege of enjoying this firsthand and hear why everybody should read this book. I have to confess that I've always been a fan of your books, Bill, but most of all a short history, as it speaks to my engineering training in wanting to understand how everything works. Where else can you read a complete and almost entirely error-free history of the development of the universe and everything in it in one handy book? Perhaps we should start an organisation that puts a copy in every hotel room. On the subject of errors, in a short history, the Errata and Corrigenda website lists only 28 errors of what I consider the most trivial nature, an outstanding achievement in a 500-page book on the history of the universe. As many of you will know from my comments at previous lectures, over the past decade, the Howard Florey has evolved into the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health, one of the world's largest centres of neuroscience. And from 1992 until 2009, I had the privilege of serving on the board of the Florey, adding my contribution to that transition. I'm now pleased to say that this process is complete, with the merger of 4 smaller neuroscience institutes and the co-location of these with the University of Melbourne's team of neuroscientists. As part of this merger, 2 new research buildings have been completed, one at the Austin Hospital campus focused primarily on clinical research, and the other on the University of Melbourne's Parkville campus focused on basic research. An additional clinical research centre has been completed in collaboration with the University and Melbourne Health at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And I and my family are greatly honoured that the university chose to name the large research building on the Parkville campus after my father, Ken. These developments at the Florey would certainly have pleased my father. He was passionate about medical research, although his point of view was that of a scientifically unsophisticated lay person. What kept his attention and enthusiasm for so many decades was the excitement of new discoveries and the belief that these could make a difference to the health and well-being of the community. It's a passion very much aligned with that of our outstanding lecturer, Mr. Bill Bryson. Would you please join me in now thanking Bill for his most entertaining and engaging lecture. And now it's my great pleasure to ask Bill to come forward and receive his medallion in commemoration of his delivery of the 16th Kenneth Myer lecture. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, once again. This concludes tonight's proceedings. On behalf of the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health, I thank you all for coming and look forward to seeing you again at the next lecture. Good evening.